Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Adult Formation at St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Cary, North Carolina. My name is George Adamik. I'm the rector here at St. Paul's, and we're glad you could join us. Glad to be with you for this series. Again, the series is called Between the Times, Being God's People in a Fragile World. And the two-part sessions that I'm doing are called Sing Us the Songs of Zion, the Psalms in Exile. Last week was part one. This week is part two, and kind of picking up some other topics we can talk about. I want to begin with this whole idea of exile, the Psalms in exile. Those are the Psalms we're kind of looking at. And I talked a little bit last time, just want to review a little bit with you, the idea of exile, that exile is not just necessarily a geographical separation of place, longing for being back to the place where you were, but in many ways it's a separation from one's source of meaning. Sociologists call it the meaning system. Our environment, the people we live with, our culture, our traditions. To be separated from those can make you feel like you're in exile as well. And I want to read a brief, well, it's a little lengthy quote about Brueggemann. He is a renowned scripture scholar, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures. And I want to read something to you that he is being quoted in about this idea of exile. He says, the experience of exile is not confined to the pages of the Bible, dealing with, hold on one second. Let me just let some folks know. I'm back. Some good folks doing good things and enthusiastic about it. And they're catching up before they depart today, right outside my door. Let me read this quote that can give us a sense of what Brueggemann talks about when he talks about exile. He says, the experience of exile is not confined to the pages of the Bible, dealing with, for instance, the Babylonian exile. Exile still exists in our midst. This serves as an example, a reminder to us that even living physically at home, one can still experience exile. Some theologians maintain that exile is not only a geographical place, but it is a religious state of mind. Brueggemann has proposed that exile is a metaphor for understanding perhaps the faith situation in the church in the United States today. He also says exile could be a metaphor with the experience of anxiety of deported people. He argues that although the Jews were geographically displaced, their biggest experience of exile was their loss of the structured, reliable world which provided them with meaning. Exile is thus primarily not a geographical issue, but a social, moral, and cultural, even liturgical and spiritual, an understanding that one is in a hostile, alien situation. Brueggemann therefore proposes that this loss of a structured, consistent, and dependable world where cherished symbols of meaning are ridiculed and rejected, and where value systems are diminished, is an important point of contact between the ancient texts and our own contemporary experience. The loss of the reliable and known world results in many people living in a strange and unfamiliar situation that does not seem like home, but creates a deep sense of being in exile. Sorry for that long quote, but I think it really speaks to us. I think today, the pandemic, the rise of racism, the rise of the divisiveness in our nation, and even in our leadership, has challenged our meaning system. It's thrust us into something, and there is cause there to feel exiled, in my opinion. So I think that when we look at these ancient texts, some of these Psalms we're going to look at today, this is not just about things that happened in the past, but it can speak to us, I think, of our own contemporary existence as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today as we gather. Just a quick review from last week. We talked about the Psalms. There are 150 Psalms put together over a period of what's suggested of 700 years. That's so hard, I think, for us to fathom. Because in those 700 years, we see the development of a people, the development of an understanding of their faith tradition. Imagine going back to the 1300s in our own time and looking at what the church was like then and what it is now. The difference is incredible. And so in the Psalms, there is that vastness of time where things change and developed. And so some of the Psalms are in particular points of time, particular ways of understanding who God is, understanding who they are in this faith tradition. So the Psalms themselves, written over 700 years, are divided up into some categories. Different scholars suggest different numbers of categories. But one set of categories that speaks to me is from Roland Murphy, who is a scripture scholar. He suggests 7 categories. Hymns of praise is one kind of psalm. Psalms that are lament psalms. We're going to look at those today. Psalms that are about thanksgiving. Psalms that are of the royal psalms. Psalms that are of wisdom. Psalms that are of a more liturgical nature. And some psalms that are considered historical. So they're categories of psalms. And so when you see a psalm, trying to get its context can give you a more understanding of what it's about. So we've been looking during this series at the Psalms of Lament, the Psalms of Lament. And we looked last week at some of the individual Psalms of Lament. Of the 150 Psalms that we find in the Bible, in the Psalter, 44 of them are considered Psalms of individual lament, 44 of them. And last week we looked at a few of those. Psalms of communal lament, there are about 12 that are looked at as being Psalms of communal lament. And so today we want to look at just a few. I'm just going to look at 3 of the communal Psalms with you and really dig into them a little bit and both read them and look at them. So just a reminder, lament, the lament is kind of a longing for something that you feel is missing, or feeling a sense of separation, a sense of alienation, perhaps. And some of the Psalms that we look at, the lament of them is so powerful. I think these Psalms are so powerful to look at. The incredible honesty that some of these psalmists had in their relationship to God. We'll look at some of these Psalms. I oftentimes wonder if we did some prayers of the people on a Sunday and put them in the form of a lament, what that would sound like. We tend not to pray this way, but this is an eye-opener to us of the faith of the ancient people. So I'm going to try to, I want to bring up something. This is just a kind of a brief history of the Hebrews scripture history. We look at the scriptures, what we see in their history, just to put these Psalms in some sort of a context and a little bit of what we're going to be looking at today. Just quickly, I don't want to spend more than a couple of minutes on this. Around 18 to 1700 BCE, before the Common Era, is what we know as the call of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham is called by God to leave his land, to move to a place that God will show him, and they will be the ancestors of so many people, like the stars in the sky. And Abraham and Sarah begin their journey. Eventually, descendants are Abraham, then Isaac, and then Jacob. You remember Jacob has 12 sons, and one of them, Joseph, is sold into slavery in Egypt. And eventually, the descendants of Jacob need to find a place to live because the difficulties they're having. They end up in Egypt, and eventually they become enslaved in Egypt. And so around 1300 to 1250 before the Common Era is what we know as the Exodus experience. That is Moses leading them out of Egypt from slavery into what is called the Promised Land. And around 1250 to 1200 BCE is the entry into the Promised Land, the land that God has promised them. And sometimes I use this reference sometimes when they enter the Promised Land, we sometimes think it was some sort of a ribbon cutting ceremony, like, they cut the ribbon, here's your land. But the challenge was that the Promised Land, there were people living there. There were nations, cities, towns, and but they believed that this land was being given to them by God. And so there were great battles. They had to conquer this Promised Land. And those were the judges. The judges were not judges as we understand them, but they were military leaders who led them into this land, conquered the nation, and eventually by around 1000 BCE, there was the monarchy. King David, one of the best known of the kings. There were many kings, King David, King Solomon, there were many, many kings. But that was the time of the monarchy. Around 922, 722, the monarchy, the kingdom, is divided into two. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom being Israel, the southern kingdom being Judah. There were reasons for that. Some of the tribes in the north and some of the tribes in the south separated from themselves, not getting into all the history of that today, but just to know that there were two kingdoms. In 721, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, was destroyed by the Assyrians. And it seems many suggest that the people of that land of the northern kingdom were kind of dispersed. Some lived there and some were dispersed. But by 587, the southern kingdom is destroyed. And that is this kingdom of Judah. And it's destroyed by the Babylonians. And the people of Judah are totally removed from that land and taken to Babylon. Thus, the Babylonian exile. And we're going to look at some Psalms today that speak of that time. I want to give you a sense of the history. Having taken this land, being a great nation, eventually being defeated, and now being in exile in Babylon. Just looking ahead, by 539 was the end of the Babylonian exile. By 538, the temple is beginning to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And by 515, the temple had been rebuilt again. And it's the temple eventually that Jesus comes to and we see in later times of history. So just wanted to give you a sense of history if that helps. I would like to look at Psalm 44. I want to dig in. I'm going to look at 3 Psalms today. That's about it. But look at them in depth. Last week, we read the Psalms as the voice of an individual lamenting. What I want to do today is really dig in a little bit and sort of analyze these Psalms a bit so we get a feeling of what this lament is about. Psalm 44 is a lament of the community. It's a communal lament. It seems that some national catastrophe has occurred. Not sure of the specifics, not sure if this is the Babylonian kind of experience in their lives, but something catastrophic has happened. Scholars take different opinions on that, but something has happened. And it's interesting, the introduction to this psalm, verses 1 through 4, we'll first read verses 1 through 4. It's an introduction that refers to God's saving actions in the past. It's like, God, you did all these things in the past. It's not that the psalmist is saying that we have experienced these saving actions, but that we've heard about them from our ancestors. It's kind of saying, God, our ancestors told us of these things that you did in the past. And so the oral tradition has handed down these victorious deeds of the past, which were performed by Yahweh. They call God Yahweh. And God did this alone without any help from Israel. So it's the first part of the psalm is the psalmist saying, God, here's what I heard you did in the past. Let's read Psalm 1 through 4. I'll read it 4. I'll put my voice to it if you could read along. We have heard with our ears, O God. Our forefathers have told us the deeds you did in their days, in the days of old, how with your hand you drove the peoples out and planted our forefathers in the land, how you destroyed nations and made your people flourish. And that could be referring to the entry into the promised land, I suspect. For they did not take the land by their sword, nor did their arm win the victory for them, but your right hand, your arm, and the light of your countenance, because you favored them. You are my king and my God. You command victories for Jacob. So the psalmist begins by saying to God, I know you did these things. I know how faithful you were to us in giving us this land. So now verses 5 through 9. Verses 5 through 9. So because of what our ancestors have told us, trust should be what our response is. If that's what our ancestors told us you did, then we need to trust in this, in you. And it seems that these verses were probably from the mouth of a military leader. And the verses read like this. Through you, we pushed back our adversaries. Through your name, we trampled on those who rose up against us. For I do not rely on my bow, and my sword does not give me the victory. Surely you gave us victory over our adversaries and put those who hate us to shame. Every day we gloried in God, and we will praise your name forever. Nevertheless, I love that word in scriptures. Nevertheless, you have rejected and humbled us and do not go forth with our armies. Notice that those former verses are, you gave us victory over adversaries. We gloried in God. We praise you. All kind of like we did these things. But nevertheless, it seems now you have rejected and humbled us and do not go forth with our armies. It's stating something. We heard from our ancestors what you did. And yes, what you did has affected our life now. But it seems like you've rejected us. And verses 10 to 17 are a description now of the present distress. Since they feel that God has rejected them, this is a description of their distress. And they're very direct that you, Yahweh, are responsible for our plight, which seems to involve some exile. You, God. Just look, before we start reading, and look at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, you. And here's how it reads. We're in this present distress, basically because of you. Can you sense this incredible relationship they had with God? And the verses read, you have made us fall back before our adversaries, and our enemies have plundered us. You have made us like sheep to be eaten, and have scattered us among the nations. You are selling your people for a trifle and are making no profit on the sale of them. You have made us the scorn of our neighbors, a mockery and a derision to those around us. You have made us a byword among the nations, a laughing stock among the peoples. My humiliation is daily before me, and shame has covered my face because of the taunts of the mockers and blasphemers, because of the enemy and avenger. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you, nor have we betrayed your covenant. Read that over again later. It's very powerful. You know, as you helped our ancestors in the past and you did defeat some of our adversaries, we're not having such a great time right now, and we're going to blame you for it. It's just this incredible way of addressing God in prayer. You did this, and you've caused this, and you've caused this, and yet, the last verse, the verse 17 is, all this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you, nor have we betrayed your covenant, because we're still talking to you. We're still offering this prayer to you. And so verses 18 through 23, despite all this claim of fidelity and trust is made on behalf of the people, despite all this, they want to claim that they are faithful, that they are loyal to God, and it's a part of who they are. So Israel is claiming to be faithful and loyal to the covenant. This is the great covenant that God set with his people through Moses and throughout their history. They're saying we're loyal to that. We're loyal, and we have been loyal to that. In a lament, it is said, we may expect to find this kind of idealization. It's kind of like, even in a relationship, you say to somebody, you really let me down, but I've been really faithful to you. I've really been your best friend. We can sometimes tend to idealize our way of relating in that relationship. The scripture scholar Sigmund Mowinkle calls this, I love this phrase, the innocence of motivation. The innocence of motivation. They are motivated to speak to God, and they're saying to God, well, you've let us down. We've been faithful. We, the people, have been faithful. Well, you've let us down. And in verse 23, there's this incredible, bold statement. It's the only place in Scripture God is explicitly said to be sleeping, kind of sleeping on the job. Wow, the boldness of these words are just incredible. Let me read verses 18 through 23. And remember this sense, even though you have let us down, our heart never turned back, nor did our footsteps stray from your path. Though you thrust us down into a place of misery and covered us over with deep darkness, if we have forgotten the name of our God, or stretched out our hands to some strange God, will not God find out? For he knows the secrets of the heart. Indeed, for your sake, we are being killed all the day long and are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Awake, O Lord. Why are you sleeping? Arise. Do not reject us forever. And then the last few verses are a bold plea made to God. This kind of wake up, God. And then they say, why have you hidden your face and forgotten our affliction and oppression? We sink down into the dust. Our body cleaves to the ground. Rise up and help us and save us for the sake of your steadfast love. That's a powerful psalm. If we can get a flavor for, they're really able to identify and face their lament. Sometimes with lament, there is frustration. Sometimes there's anger. And the sense of relationship they have with God, that they can express that. That is something that I think we could well attain in our world today. And just to face the reality of things we're going through, and find God to help and reach out and help us. Let's go to Psalm 74. This psalm, it's believed, is a psalm of the community on the occasion of the destruction in Judah, which led to the Babylonian exile. It's believed that's what this is referring to. It basically it's a psalm beginning from verses 1 to 11 that is a complaint and a description of the situation with pleas for Yahweh to please intervene. It's a plea. And verse 1 asks the question, why? It's a word oftentimes used in laments. We struggle with the question, why? When we get to a point, why, oh God? Why? I so often see this pastorally in times of people going through really difficult times, challenges in their lives as parents, or health issues, caring for parents. When things get really challenging, sometimes why is this happening? The question why is a challenging one. It's one we ask, and we find it oftentimes in the laments. But the why question is a challenging question. I tell the story years ago how challenging we find the why question. My father loved to work out in the yard. We lived in, as you know, I grew up in Yonkers, New York, and my family moved to Thornwood, New York, in Westchester County, just outside of New York City, when I was in college. And my father loved working in the yard, and he used to mow the lawn and just enjoyed it so much. Next door was a family, and they had a son. His name was Daniel. Daniel was this really inquisitive little kid. And one day my father was mowing the lawn, And Daniel comes walking across the driveway to talk to my dad, which he oftentimes did. And my father finished mowing the lawn, and Daniel says to my father, "What are you doing?" And my father says, "I'm mowing the lawn, Daniel." And Daniel says, "Why?" My father says, "Well, I haven't mowed it in a while, and it needed to be mowed." Daniel says, "Why?" My father says, "Well, the lawn got kind of long, the grass got long, and I just wanted the house to look nice, have the yard look nice, so I wanted to mow it." And Daniel says, "Why?" And my father, I'll never forget this. My father says, "Daniel, I think I hear your mother calling. Is that your mother calling you? I think you got to get home." The why question is a challenging question. Children ask it a lot of us. And oftentimes when we hear those kinds of questions, we'll tell a story sometimes to answer, because sometimes we may not know all the whys. But this psalmist expressing the lament of the community is asking the why question. Let's look at verses 1 to 11. "O God, why have you utterly cast us off? Why is your wrath so hot against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation that you purchased long ago, the tribe you redeemed to be your inheritance, and Mount Zion where you dwell." Mount Zion is where the temple was. "And Mount Zion where you dwell. Turn your steps toward the endless ruins. The enemy has laid waste everything in your sanctuary. Your adversaries roared in your holy places. They set up their banners as tokens of victory. They were like men coming up with axes to a grove of trees. They broke down all your carved work with hatchets and hammers. They set fire to your holy place. They defiled the dwelling place of your name and razed it to the ground. They said to themselves, 'Let us destroy them altogether.' They burned down all the meeting places of God in the land. There are no signs for us to see. There is no prophet left. There is not one among us who knows how long. How long, O God, will the adversary scoff? Will the enemy blaspheme your name forever? Why do you draw back your hand? Why is your right hand hidden in your bosom? Yet God is my king from ancient times, victorious in the midst of the earth." Just continual why. God, why? If you can picture the temple having been totally destroyed, and for the Hebrew people, the temple is where God dwelt. It wasn't just a building, it was identified as where God dwelt. And why have you let this happen? Why? Why? And then verses 12 through 17 is a hymn praising God. It's as if the psalmist took a hymn that existed and placed it in this psalm. And it is a hymn praising God's power in creation. It's almost like, why, God, have you let this happen? Let me spend some time reminding you who you are. I think that's what this is saying. You let the temple be destroyed. You let the lands be destroyed. We have been destroyed. Why? Let me remind you who you are. And it's a typical description of creation in terms of mythical, primordial battles between God and chaos. It's personified in dragons and Leviathan. In ancient times, there are many creation stories, many creation stories. Every culture, every people had a creation story. We know two of the creation stories of the Hebrew people. First, chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis give us two very different creation stories. But what's being called upon here in this psalm are these incredible mythical ideas of creation that probably came from the culture of their time as well. And so after saying to God, "You've let us down, let me remind you who you are. You divided the sea by your might and shattered the heads of the dragons upon the waters. You crushed the heads of the Leviathan and gave them to the people of the desert for food. You split open spring and torrent. You dried up ever-flowing rivers. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You established the moon and the sun. You fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. Remember, O Lord, how the enemy scoffed, how a foolish people despised your name. And after reminding God of who God is, there's a final plea in verses 18 through 21. In verses 18 through 21, the psalmist says, "Do not hand over the life of your dove to wild beasts." Meaning, I think, referring to themselves, us. Do not hand us over to wild beasts. Never forget the lives of your poor. Look upon your covenant. The dark places of the earth are haunts of violence. Let not the oppressed turn away ashamed. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Arise, O God. Maintain your cause. Remember how fools revile you all day long. It's a powerful psalm. Turning to God and, why are these things happening? Let me remind you, God, who you are, which is really the psalmist reminding the community of who God is. What it's really saying is, this is who God is. Let us not lament to the point of losing that sense of understanding and that sense of relationship with God. The lament names the pain, names the hurt, but remembers the relationship, remembers the greatness of God, and puts that hope in what God can do now in the form of a plea. God, please, please be God. Please make me understand how you can be God in this world and make a difference. So those are two psalms that I think are really, really powerful. And I want to conclude our time together with Psalm 137. This is Psalm 137, and it's a translation. All the other Psalms that I've been sharing with you are from the Book of Common Prayer, the translation that's in the Book of Common Prayer, except for this Psalm, Psalm 137, which is from what's oftentimes referred to as the Grail translation, Grail, which was a translation done many years ago in order for the Psalms to be chanted. I'll tell a little bit about that in a moment. So the Babylonian exile, let me give you a little bit of history. This might be too much history. If you want to refill your cup of coffee, you can do that now. But I'll give you a sense of this Babylonian exile. We're in the 7th century BCE. And in the late century, the kingdom of Judah understood that Assyria was the powerful nation. And Judah, the southern kingdom, was able to find a way to survive by being what's sometimes called as a client state of the Assyrian Empire. They learned how to survive. They were still the kingdom of Judah, but they knew how to pay homage to Assyria. In the last decades of that century, Assyria, this great nation, was overthrown by Babylon. And Babylon was actually an Assyrian province, but they stood up and defeated and overthrew Assyria. Okay. Egypt, which is to the west of Judah, fearing the rise of the Babylonians and an empire, seized control of some of the Assyrian territory up to the Euphrates River in Syria, and Babylon attacked. So now you got Egypt, Babylon overthrows Assyria, Babylon is fighting Egypt, and you know what's in between? The southern kingdom of Judah. After the defeat of Pharaoh by the Babylonians, the king of Judah began paying tribute to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. It looks like Babylon is winning here. Let's pay tribute to them. They had learned how to survive. And some of the young nobility of Judah were taken actually to Babylon. In the following years, though, the court of Jerusalem in Judah was divided into two parties, one supporting Egypt, the other supporting Babylon, trying to figure what do we need to do to survive here? Nebuchadnezzar was defeated in a battle in 601 in Egypt. And with that, this seemingly rise of Egypt, Judah revolted against Babylon. They saw Egypt as becoming the more powerful, and they revolted against Babylon. And there was a great battle that took place around 598. The king of Judah died during that siege. He was succeeded by his son as king, but Nebuchadnezzar was pretty determined at this point to defeat Judah. The city fell. It was by 587. The kingdom of Judah was destroyed by the Babylonians, totally destroyed. They had taken over Assyria. They now came into Judah, because Judah had kind of been seen as a nation that was not totally supportive of them. So they destroyed the city wall. There was a wall around the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. They destroyed the houses of many of the citizens. The people were captured and taken to Babylon. What's interesting about the Babylonian exile, it seems, is that all of the people were taken from Judah, from Jerusalem, and taken to Babylon. So they literally left their land, and everything was destroyed. Everything. The temple, the walls of the city. They were now living in a foreign land, in an alien soil. And let me read this psalm with you a bit, just to give a sense of the absolute feeling of exile and lament that they had. So verses 1 through 3 is a flashback to the early experience of the exile. It's believed that this psalm may have been written after the exile, but it is referring to what had been known in the exile, what they'd experienced in the exile. So it's a flashback. Some scholars suggest this psalm is part of a liturgical commemoration of the destruction of the temple. In other words, after the Babylonian exile, there would always be a commemoration of the exile in the temple and in places of prayer, and that this psalm may have been a psalm that was used in that liturgy. Does that make sense? The Jewish people would never forget the Babylonian exile, just as they never forget the Passover meal, which is such a significant event in Jewish history. These parts of their story are held on to and remembered. So too with the Babylonian exile, as one of the low points in their experience. So this may have been a psalm that was part of a liturgy. There were countless irrigation canals now in Babylon. Babylon was a large area, and there were canals from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that probably watered the Babylonian plain. And it's hard to escape the impression that these are personal memories that are being recalled. These are personal memories of people who are in the exile. And verse 3 captures the frequent question in Psalms of lament. Where is your God? The oppressors oftentimes will say to the oppressed, so where's your God? Where's this great God you speak of? And when that keeps being asked, you begin to wonder, where is my God? And to maintain one's faith in that. And the phrase Zion song, sing to us one of Zion's songs, refers to the Psalms. Thus the title of this class, the songs of in exile. Let's read this psalm a bit. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, remembering Zion. On the poplars that grew there, we hung up our harps. Isn't that just heartbreaking? These psalms would be sung, and they nourished and fed people, and to literally take their harps and hang them up on the trees. We can't sing the psalms. Hang them up on the trees. And it says in verse 3, for it was there that they asked us, our captors, for songs, our oppressors for joy. Sing to us, they said, one of Zion's songs. Verses 4 through 6 is a kind of a curse kind of a ban, an anathema on anyone who forget Jerusalem. While we're hanging up our harps, we can't sing our songs. We can never forget Jerusalem. May we be cursed if we forget Jerusalem. And there's a reference to the hand and the tongue is about the playing of the harp and the singing of the songs of Zion. The verse reads, "How could we sing the song of the Lord on alien soil? But if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Oh, let my tongue cleave to my mouth if I remember you not, if I prize not Jerusalem above all my joys." And verses 7 through 9 is another curse, a ban on the destroyers of Jerusalem. So beware to you who forget Jerusalem, those of us who are of the community of the Jewish people, but also on those who destroy Jerusalem. It looks like Edom ravaged Judah with the fall of Jerusalem, totally destroyed it. And the final verse in this can be really kind of upsetting. I know if we're in church praying this psalm, verse 9 kind of jumps off the page at us as if, well, couldn't we just eliminate that verse? It seems so offensive. When a nation destroyed another nation, it was part of warfare to totally destroy that nation, tear it to the ground. It was not uncommon for children to be killed, for women to be killed. It was the overtaking of a nation. Women could either be taken or killed. Children oftentimes would be killed. And there's a very, very blunt verse here that ends this psalm. But understand that it comes out of the history of its time, as horrible as it seems. And it's a reminder to us of the incredible, brutal practice of ancient warfare. Brutal. I mean, not that any war is not brutal, but this was just brutal. The final verse refers to the dashing of children on rocks. It's kind of an alarming verse, but it was part of warfare at that time. So let's read verses 7 to 9. "Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, when they said, tear it down to its foundations." So remember, Lord, against those sons of Edom. Remember at Jerusalem, when they said, tear it down to its foundations, which they did. And so to God, O Babylon, destroyer, he is happy who repays you the ills you brought on us. He shall seize and shall dash your children on the rock. That's a tough end to that psalm. This is a psalm, though, that it's probably one of my favorite psalms in the scriptures. It just, I know it has that tough verse 9 in it, but it just speaks so much of the heart of lament. This sense of exile, this sense of searching for meaning, this sense of searching for where the future will lead them, being in exile in Babylon. Always been one of my favorite psalms. I want to share a little story about this psalm. Years ago, when I was in the seminary, I was studying for the priesthood and went through a time of wondering, is this really what I want to do? Is this what I'm being called to do? Or am I being called to do something else and have a family and children? Remember, in the tradition that I was in then, those two didn't go together. Couldn't be a priest and have a wife and family. But those kinds of things are at my heart. And what was I meant to do? And it was during this time also that I was also really pondering whether I was called to the monastic life. You've heard me share this story over my years here at St. Paul's. But I'd been greatly influenced by Thomas Merton. I can't convey to you how much he influenced my life back then. And the whole idea of a monastic life, either in the Trappists or Benedictines, was very real to me. And I remember speaking with my spiritual director at the time, and he suggested I spend some time at a monastery. It was Mount Savior Monastery in Elmira, New York. where Brother David Stendelrast is a monk of. And I spent 2 summers at that monastery, living with the monastery, living with the monks there, trying to discern, where was my life to go? Where was I going to find this meaning? And during the time there, taking part in what's called the Liturgy of the Hours, the monks begin their day, Trappists begin their day at 3:30, Benedictines sleep in till 4:30, and begin their day early with vigils. And then there's morning prayer, midday prayer, mid-afternoon prayer, evening prayer, compline. It's a whole rhythm of the day. And in the monastic communities, when they're chanting the Psalms. And many monastic communities in the course of 1 week chant all 150 Psalms, believe it or not, some within the course of 2 weeks. But the Psalms nourish and feed that monastic life. This Psalm 137 came up quite a few times while I was there. And somehow the words of this psalm and the chant that they used in chanting it met to me. The chant had such a depth, it touched my heart, and the words so touched me that it just spoke to me so deeply. And it was this sense of longing for meaning and searching. Fast forward, I realized I was not called to be a monk. I became aware of that then. And God brought me to a place where I could be both a priest and have a wife and family. And the joy of the calling that God has given me has been a blessing in my life, and I give thanks for that. But the psalm spoke at such a time. What I want to do in conclusion, I've been debating whether to do this, but I'm going to try to chant this psalm as it was chanted in that monastery, and see if I can hit the notes right, if the tone of this chant and the words of this psalm speak to your heart. It may be a memory to me and speaks to my heart, but to convey that to you. Let me see if I can do this with you. And it goes. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, remembering Zion. On the poplars that grew there, we hung up our harps. For it was there that they asked us, our captors, for songs, our oppressors for joy. Sing to us, they said, one of Zion's songs. Oh, how could we sing the song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Oh, let my tongue cleave to my mouth if I remember you not. If I prize not Jerusalem above all my joys. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, when they said, tear it down to its foundations. O Babylon destroyer, he is happy who repays you the ills you brought on us. He shall seize and shall dash your children on the rock. I don't know if Rusty will be tracking me down to be in the choir, but hopefully I hit some of the notes. But to hear a psalm chanted, all the psalms are really meant to be chanted, not meant to really be recited or read. And that chant reminds me of those days. So I hope that these psalms can become part of your prayer life. They do take some engaging with and learning perhaps what they're about and what they mean. But I hope this has spoken to you during these last couple of weeks. And this time of exile, really, never in my life have I experienced our world, particularly our nation, as it exists now. Just the pain and listening to younger folks, millennials, and our youth, and the confusion of this world in which they live in. I am, in some ways, constantly hearing lament. And I hope these Psalms can be a sign to us of those who've gone before us and how much lament was a part of their spiritual life, their prayer life. Perhaps we can make that part of our life and plead to God in our prayer to guide us, to be with us, to walk with us through this exile to the new possibilities that God always has before us. So I hope this has helped you and your journey, and I'm glad you could join us. So thank you very much. It was good being with you. And thank you, Katie, for your help with placing the Psalms up for us to see.